When it comes to globalization, everyone is looking forward to the opportunities to grow politically and also economically. When we look at the war in Ukraine and also the political polarization in the US, everything, especially regarding the future, seems so ambiguous. But meanwhile, people are hungry in looking for answers. And more importantly, we are indeed looking for social and political stability. Hey everyone, this is Will, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Over the decades, that we learned so much more regarding how globalization is changing the world, particularly regarding the continent of Africa. Recently, I was very honored to host one of the interesting and meaningful events in the capital city of China. When I listened to the debates, the heated exchange among the young men and women from all the countries of Africa, they joined this great session, exchanged their views regarding globalization. On one hand, some people argue that globalization is providing so much more in terms of economic agenda or economic benefits for some countries in Africa. But on the other hand, some people disagree that globalization is leading us or misleading us towards the future of the world. Well, at the end of the day, I have to say, this event was put together by Economic and Trade Corporation of African Youth. I learned how the young people today around the countries in Africa are generating much greater noises, and also they're hoping using their opinions to change some of the current policies. I have to say, I was deeply touched by their passion and drive. I hope that in the future, we are going to see more similar events inviting not just the youth from Africa, but also around the world to discuss the meaning and the projection of globalization. Well, in this episode, we need to talk about another country also play a strategic role on the map, which is Vietnam. Needless to say that Vietnam is one of the critical countries in Southeast Asia. So in this episode, we need to talk about how Vietnam is changing this political agenda and also this economic reform under the new president. Will is fortunate to sit down with one of the scholars regarding all those matters, and I hope you enjoy the show. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Dr. Hai Hong Nguyen. Dr. Hai holds a PhD in political science. His research focuses on democratization, democratic theory, local governance and democracy, state-society relations, and the impact of social media on political transformation. Well, Dr. Hai, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Hai, again, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled Vietnam's New President, Key Takeaways for Domestic Politics and Foreign Relations. Now, before we talk about this new president, within this article, if I may ask the question, you mentioned there are top 4 pillars of the Vietnamese political system. For our audience and our viewers, we are not very much familiar with the 4 pillars. Can you help us and walk us through what are the 4 pillars of the current Vietnamese political system and why that is important?
Thank you very much, Will. I think it's a very interesting question, particularly for those who are not familiar with the Vietnamese political system. So the 4 pillars here are referred to the top or most powerful 4 positions in the Vietnamese political system. So they are members of the central committees and members of the Politburos of the Communist Party of Vietnam, which is the single ruling party in Vietnam. So at the 13th Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam, or CPV, held in 2021, 200 candidates were elected to the Central Committee, of which 180 members are officers and 20 are alternate members. So these 200 members then in the first plenary session will elect a Politburo of 18 members and the Secretary General, who is among the 18 members of the Politburo. So in the past years, 10 officer members were relieved from the Central Committee, including the 2 Deputy Prime Minister and the State President, because of their link to grand cases of corruption in Vietnam. So currently, the Central Committee now has only 170 officer members and 20 alternates. So Vietnam has recently, as you mentioned, elected the new president to replace the former president who stepped down to take political responsibility for wrongdoings committed by his junior staff, as I mentioned before. So after the recent election of the new president, the current 4 pillars today include the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Mr. Nguyễn Phú Trọng, the State President, Mr. Võ Văn Thưởng, the Prime Minister, Mr. Phạm Minh Chính, and the National Assembly Chairman, Mr. Vương Đình Huệ.
Well, Professor, again, based on what you mentioned, again, we understood the importance of the 4 pillars of the current Vietnamese political system. But let's talk about this new person. Again, as we mentioned in the intro, that this time the new president seemed to be so much younger compared with the predecessors. So my next question is, how should we understand the youth or the age in this current political system? So does that mean that it provides and offers advantages to the current political system and also to the voters? What do you make of that?
Well, apparently he's the youngest members within the Politburo. And of course, he will be only 56 years old at the next party congress or the 14th congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam in 2026. So, within the Politburo at the moment, 11 out of the 16 members, including the Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính, who is now 68, and will be 68, sorry. The National Assembly Chairperson, Vương Đình Huệ, will be 69, and the Ministers of Public Security, Mr. Tô Lâm, 69. These men have the potentials to replace the current Secretary General at the next Congress. However, the party also set the rules, the age limit rules, which is 65. So, basically, who is 65 years old will retire when at the times of the party congress is held. So that means at the 14th Congress in 2026, all the Prime Minister, the Public Security Ministers, the Chairperson of the National Assembly, and of course the current Secretary Generals will retire anyway. So that means there is a very big chance for the current president, who is, very young and only 56 years old, as I mentioned, in 2026, to be elected to replace Mr. Trọng. Of course, he will continue to stay in the president position, absolutely. So given his young age, he is eligible to sit in the top position for at least 2 more terms, or at least he will stay in the top position until 2028. So, and of course, on the other hand, the presidency term in office also subject to the term in office limit as well. So if the 2-term limit for the presidencies apply, it will make it, very clear and likely that he will be promoted to the post of the CPV Secretary General at the 15th Congress, which is supposed to be in 2031. Or even, it might be earlier if, he performed well and he get a support from the Politburos or from the party. So given his young age, he has more chance to stay in the top position and to be promoted to the position of Secretary Generals, very clearly.
Professor Hai, again, as we mentioned in the intro, of course, also as part of the title from your article, when we talk about Vietnam, it's one of the strategic partners, not just for countries in Southeast Asia and also regarding around the world. Again, I still remember last time I was fortunate to travel to Vietnam. Of course, besides enjoy this tasting, mouth-watering food, but meanwhile, I was very lucky to engage in a conversation regarding the domestic and foreign policies. Now, Professor, let's talk about the domestic policy first. Under this new president, what are some of the changes for the domestic policy? Is it just related to economic policy, or how about the social welfare and the social equality? And meanwhile, after that, could you also help us to understand Vietnam's role related to foreign policy, for example, with the US and also with other countries? And we know that today Vietnam has been one of the centers nations in Southeast Asia that played a strategic and significant part for the world economy. So what do you say to that, Professor?
Well, thank you very much. I think now in the first of all, let me emphasize the key duties of the president first. So, of course, according to the Constitution, he holds different duties, of course. But there are three key duties vested in the roles of the president. First of all, it is because he is the chairperson of judicial reform. So that is the first one. One of the duty is to promote judicial reforms in Vietnam. The second one, he is the head of the state. So he represents the countries in foreign relations. So that's the second key role. And the third key role is because he also the commander-in-chief of the military forces. So he has the duty to develop and to modernize. I would say the military and also the capacities of the militaries. So these are the three key roles of the president. Of course, as I said, according to the Constitution, he also have the influential voice in other subject areas as well. Now, in terms of the economics and foreign policies here, I would say now the national development policies, including the foreign and economic policies, are adopted at the party congress. So the Central Committee passes resolutions to implement these policies, right? And the Communist Party of Vietnam pursues a collective leadership mechanisms. So you know that in Vietnam, Vietnam does not have a one-man rule system. It is completely different from, North Korea or even China. China's Xi Jinping holds, multiple roles, and particularly the positions as the chief or the boss of the Chinese Communist Party and also the state president as well. I would say even China's applying guide of, collective leadership. They also have the Politburo, they also have the secretary and the Central Committee, but very much that Xi Jinping is the most powerful one, and even we can say he's the final decision makers. But in Vietnam, it's not as such. So whoever occupies the presidency, the foreign policies will not change. Likewise, the economic policy. So that's the first one everyone had to remember. The second one is that the president is the second ranking position in the top four pillars. So of course he, stand behind the party secretary general, and of course he has a voice, as I said, but it's not the most influential in the decision making. So overall, he cannot act differently from, his predecessors, his preceding state president. And he just a member of the collective leadership of the Communist Party of Vietnam only. And so and as I said, it is important for him to, implement perfectly of course, fulfill the three key duties that I, mentioned before. That is the most important, as that is the emphasis of his term in office.
Well, Dr. Hai, what about the foreign policy side? Again, right now, as the world continues to change and shift, on one hand, we're looking at the war in Ukraine, but on the other hand, we're looking at not only the current, but also the future projection for this world economic dilemma or world economic shift. So how do you evaluate the role of Vietnam today in terms of the foreign policy? Because again, this is one of the critical and this is one of the essential elements that we need to talk about, not just about the countries in Southeast Asia, but also really about what we call this collective and joint effort altogether. So what do you say to that when we talk about the foreign policy side under this current new president? What do you say to that?
Well, I think, as I said, Vietnam's since 1986, when the countries embarked on the Đổi mới policies, and it has adopted and implemented foreign policies of multilateralizations and diversifications. And be friendly to own countries around the world, and being a responsible members of the international community and a reliable partners. So I think, in other words, I would say that Vietnam since Đổi mới has adopted a very pragmatic foreign policies, and in fact, the adoption of that kind of foreign policy is based on the lessons that they learned in the past. So I don't think that Vietnam will change that kind of foreign policies from now on and in the future. That means Vietnam try to be involved in or engaged in any conflicts in the world. It tried to keep, strategic balancing positions in a very rapidly changing world today. So, as everyone know that with regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine now, on the one hand, Vietnam has good relationship with Russia, of course, a comprehensive strategic partner. But on the other hand, Vietnam also have good relationship with Ukraine. And that's why Vietnam tried to take a neutral position. Vietnam don't want to, show its support to Russia. Then, of course, to some extent, the country has implicitly, rejected Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If everyone read carefully the wording, in the statements by Vietnam Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespersons and also representatives at the UN, and of course, and the patterns of his voting in the on the floors of the General Assemblies over the past years with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So people can understand that Vietnam's not supporting Russia, of course. Now, with regards to the ongoing competitions between China and the United States, and other international issues in the Indo-Pacific regions broadly, I think Vietnam trying to as I said, going on the tightrope and trying to keep balance between major powers, and And of course, it will not take side with any powers. I think that's because, as I said, Vietnam want to focus on its national development, and the lesson for them that they have learned is that they put the national interest on top of any actions, any policies, and the foreign policy of Vietnam has clearly reflected that kind of approach, pragmatic approach.
Dr. Hai, I want to get back to the article. Again, this is something that you wrote, which is quite interesting. Again, this is what you mentioned, and I quote, you say this person, again, assume it's the new president, he was directly in charge of party-to-party and people-to-people relations. Now, again, today, when we talk about, well, it's understandable that we say party-to-party, but today, when we interpret people-to-people relations, I can't resist asking the question, is that a domestic issue? So in other words, how could this president or how could any official within this Vietnamese political system can be so down to earth or tangible to the citizens? Because we know that today politics is not just about power. Politics is beyond what is internal, this political change. It's more about the people. And again, looking at what's happened in the US today. So again, Dr. Hai, how should we understand this people-to-people relations in terms of the current Vietnamese political system?
Thank you, Will. I think, first of all, I need to clarify the understandings of the perceptions of people-to-people diplomacy or relations in the context of Vietnamese foreign policy. Now, Vietnamese policy is built or developed based on three pillars. First one, state-to-state diplomacy. The second one is party-to-party, diplomacy. And the third one is people-to-people diplomacy. So for state-to-state diplomacy or party-to-party diplomacy is very clear, right? And for the third one, people-to-people diplomacy, I think many people are still, confusing of these concepts in the context of Vietnamese foreign policy. So in the Vietnamese foreign policy, when they mention people-to-people relations or diplomacy, that means they want to emphasize the relationship between Vietnamese people, organizations, and people organization in another countries. So that means they talk about the relationship at the people level, citizen level between Vietnamese citizens and citizens in another countries. It can be the relationship between an NGOs in Vietnam and an NGOs in other countries. So that is what they meant in Vietnamese foreign policy, people-to-people diplomacy. It's not about the relationship or the interactions between the Vietnamese leaders and its own citizens in Vietnamese society. Okay, so that is what I mean in my article as well. So I'm looking at the relationship between Vietnamese citizens and Vietnamese organizations with the citizens or organizations in another countries. Is that what I mean? And of course, if that is something we're not clear about now, and of course, and that's why according to the the parties rules, because the current president, he was the standing members of the secretariats and also members of the party bureaus. And that's why he was in charge of the party-to-party and people-to-people diplomacies. Now, if you ask about the political leaders in Vietnam's relationship with its own citizens, that's another story, but I can talk a little bit about that. I think the relationship between political leaders in Vietnam now and his own citizens is really based on the performance based legitimacy. So it's about how the party, rule the countries, how the party can build a strong society, a prosperous society, or prosperous people, as they said. So it's very much, about the relationship between the party and the society. And for the party, it is the utmost important duty or, a mission now is to build a prosperous society, because Vietnam, for long, the people, was under, living in poor conditions, and Vietnam has long been, under the war. So that's why, for the people, for the citizens, they expect that the party have to lead the countries to a developed society. In other words, the people do not care much about who is in power. They care about the performance, economic performance of the countries, of the governments. So as long as the government or the party can lead the countries to a developed society, to modernizations, I think the party will support the party.
Dr. Hai, I know you're very busy. Now, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about the citizens in Vietnam today, especially regarding the younger generations. Again, we know that today, when we talk about social reforms or political participation, younger generations, no doubt, have much a deeper and stronger voice in terms of voicing their oppositions or opinions. Now, Dr. Hai, help us to understand what is the general attitude among the younger generations today in Vietnam, and how crucial it is for the youth to participate in today's social and political change in Vietnam.
Well, I think I would say that the attitudes of the younger generations now in Vietnam, they change very much. I would say even my generations have different attitude to the society, to the political systems, compared to my parents' generations, and of course the younger generations than my generation also have different approaches to the society and to the political system also. I think for the majority of the Vietnamese people now, I mean the majorities of the younger generations. For them, I think the pursuit of capitalism is the most important at the moment. And I said because for long, Vietnamese society was under poverty and under hardship, and that's why Vietnamese people still very much fond of pursuing capitalism, making rich, and having a well-off life. That's the most important one. And that's why once the party Secretary General Wu Chao said, the young generations now is a party to politics and its legacy. However, in Vietnam, the parties has an association or organizations of the youth. They call it the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, which is an organization gathering the young generations or young people, and this union plays a very important role in mobilizing the support and the engagements of the young people in the society. And I think, and the party and the unions have the strategies to engage the young generation and people in society and the politics. And I think the current president is also setting examples of how a young person or a member of the young generations can, becomes a leader of the countries. So I think that might be, I don't know, I can't read behind the words or the minds of the Vietnamese leadership environment, but he can be a good examples for the young generations to look at and to learn from him. That there's always a chance for them to rise up to the decision-making position and to the top leadership position. So I think that would be something the young generations can learn from. And of course, the current president will take opportunities to talk to the young generations in Vietnam, and because he used to be the leaders of the Vietnamese too. He was the first secretary of the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union before. So he absolutely set a good example. And of course, as I said, in order to attract the young generation in society, to mobilize engagement in society, in politics, it's important for the party, for the governments to set out a clear strategy and to show that, they are well cared by the government, by the party, and in order for the party to attract, they need to create some kind of mechanisms to get more, favorable environment, some kind of framework in order to convince the young generation that they have opportunities. They are not, left behind, or there's something that they have less opportunities than other people who have well connection with the system or the network. So anyway, it is important for the government and the party to create a kind of a fair, equal framework and environment for the young generations to feel that they are welcome, they are encouraged to participate in the society and the system.
Well, that's why, Dr. Hai, you are one of the distinguished scholars that are able to comment on such issue. Again, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, going back to the article, towards the end of the article, that you mentioned for the following 3 years is going to be very crucial for the new president, because not only related to domestic policy and also for this international relations. So again, Professor Hai, going back to the question, what are we expecting for the following 3 years from this person? And perhaps it's not just about this person. It's about the cabinet. It's about the officials within the party. So can you help us to understand what are the significant changes or expectations for the following 3 years after this new president officially takes place?
Well, I think for any predictions in a society like Vietnam, where it is a single-party rule society, I think it's very difficult. In fact, and of course, predicting his possible consequential impacts on Vietnamese politics at this stage is very hard. We still have 3 more years to come to the next party congress in 2026, and of course, because he's young, he's quite new in the position. But having said that, it does not mean he does not have any experience. He does not have the competency, particularly as I mentioned before, that he, looking at his 70-year political career, he has taken different positions, both at the central level and local level. And in the past 2 years, he was in the positions of standing committees of the Secretariat of the Politburo, which is in charge of, domestic affairs and foreign affairs. He has been performing quite well, and he has proven his ability, including his position as the vice chairperson of the Central Committee for Anti-Corruption and Prevention of Negative Practices. So I think now, of course, he's now in quite influential position, a very important position, as the head of the state and of course, state president. So in the next 3 years, I think is a period that he will face a test of his, ability and competencies in the new roles, which is more important, of course. And I said, his test, his competencies will be judged on the three key duties rested on him, as I mentioned before, as the commander-in-chief of the military, and the chairperson of the Judicial Reforms Committee, and of course as the head of the state. So he must prove his performance at least in these three key areas. Now, in terms of the foreign relations space, this week there's a test for him. He's going to welcome the Australian Governor General, David Hurley, who is going to pay an official visit to Vietnam this week, beginning from today. So he will, first of all, on the public service to the outside world as the head of the state, right? So his appearance in this space, is very important in this. So it will be the first test for him to show how he's acting as the head of the state, representing the countries, in foreign relations and overseas. So I think overall, between now and 2026, if he performs well, and in these, of course, three key areas, and of course continues to gain the trust and support from Mr. Chao, the party Secretary General, and also who is also the chairperson of the Committee for Anti-Corruption. If Mr. Thượng, the president, so that he continued to support and he has a strong hand or fist on anti-corruption and prevention of negative practices, then he can get more support from Mr. Trump, and he is very likely to replace Mr. Trump in the next Congress. So, or even if he performed well as the head of the state, as the a capable person in fighting corruption, he might be has opportunity possibility to be promoted to hold concurrently two positions, which is the head of the state or the president, and also the party secretary general. Who knows? Because of his young age and also his well performance. So I think overall between now and 2026 is a period testing his ability and competency. So if he performs well, then he will continue to stay in the position and even promoted to hold more important positions in the future.
Well, that's why, Professor, again, not only for the following 3 years, not just for Vietnam, but also for every single country, again, for any newly elected leaders, not just about the years, it's actually about, again, what, Professor, you mentioned the word performance. Because again, at this moment, it's crucial. We need to pay closer attention, not only about what they say, but also about the actions behind the words. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to have our distinguished professor, again, Dr. Hai Hong Nun. Again, Dr. Hai holds a PhD in political science. His research focuses on democratization, democratic theory, and local governance and democracy, state-society relations, and the impact of social media on political transformation. I strongly encourage everyone go online, look for his latest article, which is entitled Vietnam's New President, Key Takeaways for Domestic Politics and Foreign Relations. Well, Professor, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's always a pleasure and honor to speak to a distinguished scholar like you, and we'd love to have you back on the show again for future episodes related to not just about Vietnam, but also all the matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this, Professor.